Many people have a hard time believing that a man thousands of years ago rose from the dead. But by the end of this video, I will show you why you've been thinking about it all wrong, that Jesus was real and that he did rise from the dead, and why that is the greatest news you could possibly receive. But before we talk about Jesus, I want to talk about something happening inside your head right now. Social scientists call it a plausibility structure. It's an internal filter built up over years from your personal experiences that quietly decides what you consider possible and what you've already ruled out before the evidence even arrives. And here's why that matters. Most people haven't rejected Jesus because they looked at the evidence and found it unconvincing. Most people have rejected Jesus because their plausibility structure already decided the conclusion before the investigation started. And if you are willing, for just the next few minutes, to push back on that internal filter, I am going to show you the historical case proving that Jesus was real and did rise from the dead. Here's what we're asking today. Was Jesus of Nazareth a real person? And did he rise from the dead? Historians, including secular ones who have no interest in promoting Christianity, overwhelmingly accept that Jesus of Nazareth existed. We have more historical documentation for Jesus than we do for Julius Caesar, and nobody's plausibility structure fights them on that. The earliest accounts of Jesus' life weren't written centuries later by people with an agenda. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, men who physically walked with Jesus, watched him die, and then claimed they saw him alive again. Mark wrote down the account of Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, and Luke is particularly fascinating because Luke openly tells you his methodology. In Luke chapter 1, verse 4, he writes that he has thoroughly investigated these events, interviewed eyewitnesses, cross-referenced sources, done the work, so that his reader may be certain. Luke writes like a historian, not a mystic. Now here's where your filter might be pushing back. Dead people don't come back to life. Therefore, this is not worth serious investigation. But consider this. Imagine someone from 150 years ago waking up in a modern airport. They hear an announcement inviting passengers to board a metal tube, fly 7 miles above the earth at hundreds of miles per hour, and land safely in another city. That would sound absolutely insane. Not because it isn't true, but because they have no plausibility structure for it. They've never seen it, never heard of it, never experienced it. Their filter would reject it before a single piece of evidence was examined. That is exactly what happens when most modern people encounter the resurrection. The filter pushes back. Case closed. But the filter isn't evidence. It's a prior assumption. The real question isn't, is resurrection the kind of thing I already believe in? The real question is, what actually happened in Jerusalem in approximately 30 AD? The evidence that's hard to dismiss. Here's what we know historians, including skeptical ones, broadly agree on. 1. Jesus existed and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is documented not just in Christian sources, but in Roman historian Tacitus and Jewish historian Josephus. 2. His tomb was found empty. Even Jesus' enemies didn't deny the tomb was empty. Their response wasn't, the body is still there. It was, his disciples stole it. You don't need to explain a theft if there's no empty tomb. 3. His followers genuinely believed they saw him alive. This isn't in dispute either. The question is, what explains it? 4. The movement exploded in Jerusalem, the same city where Jesus was executed, where people could have easily disproved it, within weeks of the crucifixion. German theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg, not one for sentimental thinking, wrote that the evidence for the resurrection is so strong that nobody would seriously question it except for 2 things. First, it's an unusual event. And second, if you believe it, you have to change the way you live. That second one is worth sitting with. The disciples didn't benefit from lying. Here's one of the strongest pieces of the case. If the disciples invented the resurrection, what did they gain? Not money, not power, not social standing. The first 3 centuries of Christianity were characterized by persecution, imprisonment, and execution. These men, most of whom died for what they were proclaiming, had every reason in the world to recant if it wasn't true. People will die for something they believe is true, even when it isn't. But people don't willingly die for something they know they made up. The resurrection didn't make the disciples' lives easier. It made them harder, and yet not one of them recanted. One of Jesus' original 12 followers was a man named Thomas. And Thomas is important to this conversation because Thomas essentially had your plausibility structure. When the other disciples told him they had seen Jesus alive, Thomas said flatly, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands and put my hand into his side." Thomas has been called Doubting Thomas for 2,000 years, and I think that's unfair. A better name would be Rational Thomas. He wasn't being faithless, he was being careful. He understood that if this was real, if Jesus actually came back from the dead, then everything Jesus had said was also true. And that changes everything. He wasn't willing to step into that without verification, and Jesus didn't rebuke him for it. When Jesus appeared to Thomas, he went straight to him. He said, "Put your finger here, look at my hands, place your hand in my side." The empty tomb never resists honest investigation. That's the through line of this entire story. The angel at the tomb didn't ask the women to simply trust his word. He said, "Come and see." That is the same invitation extended to you. Here's what's worth acknowledging honestly. You don't get what Thomas got. You don't get to put your fingers in the nail wounds. You won't walk up to a physical empty tomb. And it would be dismissive to pretend that's not a real tension. But here's what I want you to notice. The invitation has never actually been about physical proximity to Jesus. It has always been come and see, meaning look at the evidence in front of you and be honest about what it points to. Thomas's generation had one kind of evidence. You have another. And the evidence available to you is more substantial than your plausibility structure may have ever allowed you to consider. Start with the historical case we've already laid out. The empty tomb, the eyewitness accounts, the explosion of a movement in the city where it could most easily have been disproved, the disciples who died rather than recant. That's not nothing. For many serious thinkers, that case alone has cracked the filter open. But there are other ways people have encountered the realness of God that are worth taking seriously. Countless people across every culture, every century, and every level of education report an experience of being known, a moment of clarity that arrived from somewhere outside themselves, an answered prayer that had no reasonable explanation, a sense of presence in their darkest hour that didn't feel like wishful thinking. Psychologists can label it. They can't fully explain it. Then there's the person of Jesus himself. Even people who aren't sure what to do with the resurrection often find, when they actually read the Gospels, that Jesus is unlike anyone they expected. He's not a comfortable religious figurehead. He's disruptive, specific, and strangely personal. His teachings on forgiveness, on how power works, on what human beings are actually worth, they don't feel like invented wisdom. They feel like something someone knew. And then there's the transformation argument, perhaps the most undeniable one because you can observe it yourself. Find someone whose life was genuinely wrecked, addiction, rage, profound emptiness, who encountered Jesus and was changed, not improved, changed. That kind of transformation has a source, and it's worth asking what it is. None of these individually may flip your plausibility structure, but together they represent something. And the invitation remains exactly what it was at the empty tomb. Come and see, not believe blindly, not feel something once and call it faith. Come, investigate, ask, read, sit with the discomfort. The evidence has never been afraid of honest scrutiny. Here's the thing about your plausibility structure. It was built to protect you, but sometimes it protects you from the truth. If Jesus rose from the dead, then he was right about everything. About God, about forgiveness, about what separates us from the life we were meant to live, and about what happens after we die. He didn't speak about death as something final. He spoke about it the way you talk about sleep. If the resurrection happened, then the cross worked. Your guilt isn't permanent. Your shame isn't final. Your past doesn't get the last word. And if it happened, then the question isn't really about history anymore. The question is, what will you do with it? Thomas, who demanded evidence before he believed, eventually traveled 1,000 miles to India as a missionary and died for what he had seen. Not because believing was comfortable, because once he encountered the evidence, he couldn't pretend otherwise. You don't have to have everything figured out. Thomas didn't. You just have to be willing to investigate honestly with your filter loosened enough to follow the evidence where it leads. Come and see.